The morning I found out, I was standing in my kitchen in Sudbury, wearing the same flannel shirt I'd slept in, waiting for the kettle to boil. It was a Tuesday in late February, the kind of cold that gets into the walls no matter how much you've spent on insulation. My coffee tin was almost empty, I remember that. I was thinking about whether I needed to drive to the grocery store before the snow picked up again. I was not thinking about my bank account. I was not thinking about my son. That's the part that still gets me. How ordinary the moment was before everything changed. My name is not important. What matters is that I'm 61 years old. I spent 32 years as a site supervisor for a construction firm up here in Northern Ontario. And 18 months ago, I discovered that the person I trusted most in the world had been quietly, methodically, and legally, or close enough to legally, moving my retirement savings into accounts I didn't control. The kettle hadn't even finished boiling when my phone rang. It was my accountant, Gord. I've known Gord since our kids were in the same hockey league. He's not the kind of man who calls you before 9 in the morning unless something is genuinely wrong. I picked up on the second ring. She said, "I need you to come in today." Not tomorrow. Today. I asked him what was going on. There was a pause on the line that I didn't like. "Just come in," he said. "Bring whatever statements you have." I stood there for a moment after we hung up, kettle screaming behind me. I had a feeling in my chest like I'd missed a step in the dark. Not pain exactly. More like the absence of the floor. Let me back up a little. My wife, Patricia, we called her Pat, passed away from pancreatic cancer 3 years ago. It was fast. 4 months from diagnosis to the end. I won't dwell on that part because I've already done enough dwelling. What I'll say is that when you lose someone you've been with for 34 years, the paperwork that comes after is its own kind of grief. The accounts, the beneficiaries, the calls to Service Canada. The estate lawyer, who speaks very slowly and uses words you have to look up later. I was not in a good place to be making financial decisions. I knew that about myself, and my older son Martin knew that too. Martin is 40. He lives in Barrie. He's a mortgage broker. Does well for himself. Always dressed sharp. Always knows the right thing to say at the right time. After Pat died, he drove up to Sudbury 3 weekends in a row to help me sort through everything. He was good. Patient. He sat at the kitchen table with me for hours going through statements and documents. He took things off my hands. That's what I kept telling myself in the years after. He was taking things off my hands. My younger son, Derek, is 36. He lives 20 minutes from me, in Chelmsford. He works at the mill. He doesn't dress sharp. He doesn't always say the right thing. When Pat was sick, Derek was the one who drove her to her treatments when I couldn't leave the site. He was the one who sat with her. He was the one who called me at work one afternoon in October and told me to come home now. "Dad, you need to come home now." Derek is not the kind of person who gets credit in rooms where credit is being given out. He never has been. After Pat died, it was Derek who kept showing up at my door, shoveling my walk without being asked, dropping off food his had made, sitting with me on the back porch on Saturday afternoons not saying much, just being there. Martin called, texted, offered advice, sent articles about grief counseling and estate planning. I thought I had 2 good sons. Gord's office is on Larch Street. I drove over that afternoon through blowing snow, parked crooked in the lot because I was distracted, and went in. He had printed out a stack of documents. He had them laid out on his desk before I even sat down. Gord is not a man who beats around the bush. He leaned back in his chair and said, "When did you set up the investment account with Northern Shield Capital?" I looked at him. "What account?" He slid a sheet of paper toward me. It had my name on it, my SIN number, a date, about 14 months earlier, just a few weeks after the anniversary of Pat's death, and a signature that was, in the worst and most unsettling way, almost exactly like mine. "I didn't set up this account," I said. Gord nodded slowly, like he'd expected me to say that. He walked me through what he'd found. He'd been preparing my taxes, same as every year, and something hadn't added up. The RRSP that Pat and I had been contributing to since the late 90s, the one that was supposed to have around $380,000 in it, had been drawn down. Not emptied, but drawn down significantly, in a series of transfers over 14 months, into this Northern Shield account that I had apparently opened but had no memory of opening, and had certainly never received statements for. There was $112,000 missing. I sat in that chair in Gord's office, and I felt the room do something strange. Not spin exactly. More like it paused, like the air went still. "Is it possible," Gord said carefully, "that Martin helped you open this account at some point? Maybe when he was helping you with the estate? I thought about those 3 weekends. Martin at my kitchen table, patient, organized, taking things off my hands. I'm going to need you to tell me everything, Gord said. Martin had been named as my power of attorney for property. I'd done that through the estate lawyer after Pat died, because the lawyer had recommended it, because Martin was the one sitting there with me, and Derek was at the mill, and it had seemed sensible at the time. Martin managed his own clients' mortgages and investments. He understood this stuff. I trusted him. A power of attorney for property in Ontario gives someone broad authority to manage your financial affairs. I had understood this in an abstract way. I had not understood what it looked like in practice when the person holding it decided to use it for themselves. Gord referred me to a civil litigation lawyer named Sandra that same afternoon. Sandra works in a firm on Elm Street. She has a very calm manner that I later understood was intentional. She deals with people in crisis, and she's learned to be the steadiest person in the room. She explained what had likely happened. Martin had used the POA to open the Northern Shield account. The transfers from my RRSP had been structured carefully, none large enough to trigger automatic flags, spread across enough months to look like normal investment activity. He'd had the statements sent to a different address. He'd listed himself as a secondary account holder. Is this illegal? I asked. It's a serious breach of fiduciary duty, she said. In Ontario, a POA is required to act in the donor's best interests. What you're describing is the opposite of that. Whether it rises to criminal fraud depends on the specifics. But yes, what you're describing is a crime. I drove home that evening and sat in my truck in the driveway for a long time. The house was dark. It was the kind of quiet that feels personal. I kept thinking about Martin at my kitchen table, the way he'd been so organized, the way he'd sorted everything into folders, the way he'd said, "Don't worry, Dad, I've got this." I'd been so relieved. I want to tell you about the moment I started to understand. About 6 weeks after my visit to Gord, Sandra had gathered enough documentation to confront Martin. His lawyer suggested we try mediation before taking it to court. I didn't want to sit in a room with my son and talk about what he'd done to me, but Sandra said it was worth hearing what he had to say. We met in a boardroom in Barrie on a Thursday afternoon. Martin came in dressed in a charcoal gray suit. He looked good. He always looked good. He sat across the table from me and his lawyer and Sandra, and he put a folder of his own down on the table, and the first thing he said was that he'd been managing these funds for my protection. I let him talk. I had learned by then to let him talk. He said the Northern Shield account was a legitimate investment vehicle. He said he'd been concerned about the way I was managing my finances after Pat died. He used the phrase, cognitive vulnerability, which I will never forget, and he said he'd made decisions on my behalf that he believed were in my best interest. Then his lawyer said something that made Sandra stiffen slightly beside me. He suggested that perhaps Derek had encouraged me to pursue this matter. He implied that Derek, who lived close by, might have his own motivations for wanting to discredit Martin's role as POA. I looked at my son across that table, in his suit, with his folder, using phrases like cognitive vulnerability to describe his 61-year-old father, who built 32 years of career with his hands in his head. And I thought about Derek shoveling my walk in the dark before I woke up. Derek sitting on my back porch on Saturday afternoons. Derek's wife dropping off a pot of stew with a note in her handwriting that said, "We're just down the road, don't forget." I thought about how Martin had tried to make this about Derek, how easy that move was for him. "I want to be very clear," I said to the room, and it was maybe the first time I'd spoken since the meeting started. My son Derek has not encouraged me to do anything. My accountant found $112,000 missing from my retirement savings. That's why I'm here. Martin looked at me across the table. For just a second, something shifted in his expression. Not guilt exactly. More like recalculation. I looked away. I was done looking at him. The investigation took several months. Sandra worked with a forensic accountant, a quiet woman from Sudbury who had the kind of focused attention to detail that I imagine makes her very good at finding things people have tried to hide, and she found things. The Northern Shield account had received $112,000 from my RRSP. Of that, approximately $68,000 had been transferred again, into an account in Martin's name alone. The remaining $44,000 was still in Northern Shield, which Martin's lawyer characterized as evidence of his good intentions. Sandra characterized it as evidence that he hadn't finished. Martin's lawyer proposed a repayment plan. Martin would return the $68,000, over 18 months, without admitting wrongdoing. The $44,000 in Northern Shield would be returned to my RRSP. The POA would be revoked, and we would not pursue criminal charges. Sandra told me, privately, that I could push for criminal prosecution, that what Martin had done likely met the threshold for fraud over $5,000 under the criminal code, which in Canada carries serious consequences. She also told me that criminal proceedings would be long, expensive, emotionally exhausting, and uncertain. That civil recovery was more predictable, that it was my decision. I sat with that for a week. I am not going to tell you I made that decision lightly. I thought about Pat. I thought about what she would have wanted. I thought about the fact that Martin had a wife and 2 kids in Barrie who hadn't done anything wrong. I thought about how a criminal conviction follows a person forever. I thought about how I'd spent 32 years teaching young guys on job sites that the point wasn't to destroy someone when they made a mistake. It was to make sure the mistake didn't happen again. But then I thought, this wasn't a mistake. This was 14 months of decisions. This was a folder. This was a boardroom with a lawyer and a phrase like cognitive vulnerability used against your own father. I called Sandra and told her I wanted to pursue it. The RCMP file took time. These things always do. Martin's lawyer tried several angles, that the transfers had been consensual, that I had impaired judgment after Pat's death. They kept coming back to that Martin had acted with good intentions that had simply been misapplied. None of it held up against the forensic accountant's timeline. The dates were clear. The transfers were clear. The secondary account in Martin's name was clear. He was charged in the spring. Fraud over $5,000. Breach of trust. I'm not going to tell you what happened in the courtroom, because that story is still working its way through the system, and I've been told to be careful about what I say publicly. What I will tell you is that Martin is no longer my power of attorney, that the money has been returned, that the account with Northern Shield no longer exists, and that on the day Martin was formally charged, Derek drove over to my place after work. He didn't call ahead. He just showed up at the door in his work clothes, smelling like the mill, holding a 6-pack of Molson Canadian, and he looked at me and said, "You doing okay, Dad?" I let him in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Martin had once organized my life into folders, and we didn't talk about Martin much. We talked about the Sudbury Wolves, who had been having a decent season. We talked about whether spring was actually coming, or if February was going to go on forever. We talked about Derek's youngest, who had just started skating and kept falling over with a huge grin on his face. We didn't say the important things out loud because we didn't need to. That's the thing about Derek. He doesn't need you to perform your gratitude. He just shows up. There are things I wish I had done differently. I wish I hadn't been so quick to let Martin take things off my hands. I was grieving and I was tired, and someone offered to carry the weight and I let them. I understand why I did it. I don't forgive myself easily for it. I wish I had understood what a power of attorney actually meant. Not in theory, but in practice. In Ontario, you can designate a continuing power of attorney for property that remains valid even if you become mentally incapable. It's an important document. It's also a document that can be misused by someone who knows how the rules work. If you have one, or you're considering setting one up, I would tell you, talk to your own lawyer, not the person you're giving the authority to. Keep your own copies of everything. And make sure that someone outside the arrangement, your accountant, a trusted friend, has access to your financial statements. I wish I had looked more carefully at who was actually there, not who showed up at the right moments with the right words, who just showed up. I still live in Sudbury. I still drink my coffee too strong. The retirement I'd planned with Pat is going to look different than I'd imagined, partly because of what Martin did, and partly because life just goes that way sometimes. It's not gone. It's not ruined. I'm 61, not 80. There's still time. Last Saturday, Derek and his wife brought the kids over. His youngest, the one who just started skating, ran into my kitchen in her socks and immediately started looking in my cupboards for the cookies she'd apparently heard were in there. I made a pot of chili. We watched the Leafs lose, which is a time-honored Canadian tradition, and nobody seemed particularly upset about it. At some point in the evening, Derek and I ended up on the back porch, same as always, and it was cold but not unbearably cold, and we stood there looking at the yard for a while, not saying much. He said, "You know, you don't have to be okay about all of it." I said I knew that, he said. "Just saying." I said I knew. We went back inside. His daughter was asleep on my couch with her boots still on, one of them half falling off, His wife was doing the dishes without being asked. The game was still on. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, and I looked at all of it. The mess and the noise and the ordinary, unremarkable realness of it. And I thought about Pat, who would have been right in the middle of it, talking too loud and laughing at things that weren't that funny. She used to say that the people who love you quietly are the ones you should hold on to. She meant it about me at the time. She was talking about something else entirely. But she was right. She usually was. The son who showed up in the dark to shovel my walk. The son who drove my wife to her treatments. The son who sat on my back porch and said nothing and meant everything. I'd spent years being proud of the one who wore the suit. I should have been paying closer attention to the one who just kept coming back.